Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Redeemer Lutheran Church Bible study on the Book of Proverbs. Pastor Eric Kleinschmidt with you once again to discuss Proverbs chapter 14. I'll put the worship link from our service live stream up above for you. Today, we're going to continue the sort of random collection of the wisdom of King Solomon. We've seen this in the past two chapters where there's a lot of different topics all kind of thrown together, and yet they do sort of coalesce into different sections. So there'll be the similar words that we'll see. Today we'll see a whole bunch of verses that are actually meant for his kids that would rule. Okay, so they're meant for more royal advice, and we see that because they are bookended with advice to the king. Okay, so there's things that are going on in the Hebrew that don't really get translated over into the English to let us see how some of these proverbs are linked together. And so to the English reader, it can just seem like a smattering of different topics. And yet, if you could hear it and know it in the original language, it would follow a little bit more of an artistic arrangement. Still, the wisdom is there regardless, and that's what we're really interested in. We're going to see the same pattern of saying like a positive statement and then a contrasting negative statement, or in some cases it begins with a negative statement and then gives the positive. We're definitely going to see that same old division between the path of righteousness and the path of foolishness. Again, that's something to always keep in mind as you're reading the book of Proverbs, that this is sort of an overarching theme that either you're on one or the other, and you don't want to hop from one to the other. So wisdom of Proverbs is really meant to kind of keep you on that path to righteousness. So keep thinking about that path as we continue to go through here, and let's look at Proverbs chapter 14. Proverbs 14 begins with that age-old theme of the woman building a house. So we have the wise woman and the foolish woman throughout the book of Proverbs. We also see the metaphor of being wise and building a house on the rock, the solid foundation that is Jesus Christ and the Word of God. That themes throughout the scriptures as well. And so we see that all coming together here in verse 1. The wisest of women builds her house, but folly with her own hands tears it down. So first we see the contrast between the way of righteousness and the way of foolishness. Okay, definitely that's there. And we see the end result. Okay, you either had a beautifully built house or you have rubble, depending on what path you've been on. What I find most interesting here is this little prepositional phrase, with her own hands. We might say folly tears it down, and then we say, oh, the terrible things happened to her. She was innocent. But the proverb here is really leveling the accusatory tone at the woman who built it herself and then through her own foolishness tore it down. I think this lends itself to a greater understanding of our own sinfulness and our own foolishness, right? Because one of the first things that we do whenever we are confronted with our own sin, somebody says, you have wronged me, our immediate reaction for most people is self-defense. And that usually includes blame on others, or blame on a situation, or even sometimes blame on God, and deflection, and then justification. So, you have offended me and you hurt me personally. And I say, well, wait a minute. I did what I had to do, and it was only right. And the situation was difficult. I didn't really have a choice, or I think it was better for you in the long run, or I'm not the one who put you in the situation to begin with, and you would have done the same in my shoes. All of that sort of talk is a self-justification. One of the hardest things for sinners to do is to admit that the thing they are suffering from is a result of their own sinfulness and foolishness and folly. But so often it is. And what delineates a wise person from a fool is their ability to see that they are themselves responsible, to learn from it, and to accept those facts as being true and part of life. So that's what leads us into a true confession and true contrition of our confession, when we can say, I only I only am responsible for my sin. That, yes, it was a difficult situation, but I could have made the right choice. Those sorts of things. So it's really speaking to human nature, and Solomon's wisdom definitely understands human nature. And one of the hardest things for us to ever admit is that what we're suffering from right now, and maybe even crying out to God for relief from, is often the result of poor decisions or selfish sins that we have made in the past that have led us to this point. That's a real type of honesty that's difficult to stomach sometimes, and yet it is so necessary for our spiritual life and our mental health, and for making a right confession, I would say, and receiving the full joy of Christ's forgiveness when God says, yeah, I know it's your fault, but I still forgive you. Verse 2, whoever walks in uprightness fears the Lord, okay, path of righteousness, but he who is devious in his ways despises him. Why? Why do those who like to be devious and be wicked and get things that they did not work for, and all those bad things that we think of as vices, why do they despise the Lord? Well, because the Lord speaks against those things. To acknowledge the Lord has a right to tell you what you can and cannot do is difficult when you have a sinful heart that's bent on doing the things that God says you can't do or shouldn't do. So that's a difficult situation. And so it's a really good conclusion to just then pretend that God doesn't exist, or that it doesn't matter, or that his word is outdated and needs to be updated, or any other number of ways that we try to get around God being God and having any claim on our lives and what we do with them. So again, if you're on the path of righteousness, wisdom is one who fears the Lord and takes his wisdom above your own. Foolishness is one who despises the Lord because you don't want to hear what God has to say because it goes against what you want to do. Verse 3, by the mouth of a fool comes a rod for his back, but the lips of the wise will preserve them. Here that we've seen this theme before of those who speak truth don't have to remember what lie they've told whomever. They can just kind of be secure in what they've said, and there's a security there. Also, we believe that the truth will win out in the end, and so honesty is of value in that case. But of probably the most interested in this verse is that by the mouth of a fool comes a rod for his back. This translation makes it seem as if the person who is speaking foolish things eventually has to suffer the recompense and answer for those foolish things, be beaten with the rod, as it were. That's how most translations translate it, and I don't think that's the best way. I'm not a biblical translation scholar, but when I look at the Hebrew, what I see that it actually says is, by the mouth of a fool comes a rod of arrogance, or a rod of pride, or a rod of haughtiness. That's all that it says. It does that for his back. I don't get where that is the best translation for that. So, yes, obviously this is part of the beauty of the Proverbs, right? Solomon may have had this one thing in mind, but when we read it, it's applicable in 5 or 6 different ways, and sometimes a lot more than that. So yes, we do believe that one who speaks foolish things will eventually receive their just punishment for them, right? So in that sense, it's true. But also, I think that there is another aspect here when we translate it the other way, that there's a rod of arrogance, a rod of pride, is that they hurt others, okay? That they use their arrogance, their pride, and their foolishness to beat others, okay? And I definitely see that theme of that there's a communal aspect to wisdom and to foolishness. We've seen that in a couple chapters back. And so I think that theme comes out better when we translate it, by the mouth of the fool comes a rod of pride. Verse 4, where there are no oxen, the manger is clean, but abundant crops come by the strength of the ox. Okay, so everybody wants a clean manger, right? This is the plastic covering on the sofa kind of deal. Like, so, yeah, you buy a new sofa and it comes all wrapped in plastic, and you like, I'm just going to leave that on there. And so, yeah, the sofa stays clean, but it's not very welcoming. And what's really the sofa for? Is it to remain pristine and look nice? Well, I guess maybe in some houses it might be, but for most of us, no, it's for your family to sit on. And if you have in your mind that it's basically there to live out its life and be destroyed by your family, especially when you have toddlers, oh my. Um, Maybe teenagers are worse. I don't know. But yeah, if you're trying to keep it pristine, there's ways to do that, but that's not what it's really meant for. So yeah, a clean manger is nice. It's not filled with slime and drool from the animals and leftover bits of grain and whatever you're feeding them. You could put baby Jesus in it and set it out front of your church, right? It looks nice, but it's not what it's for. It's meant to be covered with slime and slop, and you really wouldn't want to put a baby in unless that was the only thing you had, right? So, what is the purpose? So, where there are no oxen, the manger is clean, but the people are not doing well because you actually need crops to live. So, yeah, you have to use things up in order to get their benefit, and also. The theme of hard work is here too. Again, that's a theme that runs through Proverbs. Hard, honest work pays off. And I know that sounds really quaint and trite because we hear it so much, especially in American culture. But it is a theme that runs through Proverbs. And where do you think American culture got that from? Again, you got a bunch of deists coming over, who believe in God, particularly the Christian God, who are familiar with the scriptures. Did some weird things with them because America became like the home for all of the weirdo Christians that were being persecuted in their own countries. They came over to the land of the free, right? And brought that weirdness with them, which is part of why we have so many issues with Christianity here. But for the most part, the people that founded our nation in that respect would have been familiar with the wisdom of Proverbs, wisdom of God through the scriptures, whether they believed in it or not. And obviously that's going to carry over into the character of the United States. And so we've heard a lot, but we got that from somewhere, and that wisdom came from God, and it's here in Proverbs. Verse 5, a faithful witness does not lie. Duh, right? But a false witness breathes out lies. Okay, yeah, we get that. So sometimes I'm sure there's more to digest there, but on the surface, it's like, okay, Solomon, that one really wasn't. Not everybody can hit home runs every time they step to the plate, okay? And that was like a single, maybe a double at least, all right? A scoffer seeks wisdom in vain, but knowledge is easy for a man of understanding. So someone who scoffs at what other people try to tell them and yet wants to be wise is never going to get there, okay? Vanity. It's going to just emptiness. But knowledge is easy for a man of understanding. So one who is seeking to understand is open to listen and learn. Knowledge is going to come easier. I think it's also kind of like an object in motion tends to stay in motion. So once you kind of get on the path to learning things and growing in that respect, it becomes easier to learn and grow in things, right? So I think I experienced this just being in school, like, so right after high school where I was learning things and I went right into college, 4 years there. And then right after college, I went to seminary, 4 years there. I didn't take any breaks in between, didn't have any gap years or anything like that. Particularly because I was fearful that if I stopped, I wouldn't go back. Like now that I'm old, I'm fearful of sitting down and I might not get up again. I'm going to be 42 this year. Oh my! So I'm starting to like understand that concept a little bit more. Like now I got to keep going or I'll stop. So I think the kind of the same thing happens with learning. And when we're in the academic world, it's easier to pick things up. If we stop for a while, it's hard to get started again. Okay, and so I think someone who is seeking understanding, knowledge comes a little bit easier because they're in that world and in that mindset. I think that's also an aspect of what Solomon is talking about here. 7, leave the presence of a fool, for there you do not meet words of knowledge. Okay, we've talked before last week about 1 Corinthians 15, I think it is, where bad company ruins good morals, right? So here we see this once again, where we're actually called to walk away from people who are on the path to foolishness. Notice that Solomon in his wisdom doesn't say try to win them over, try to argue them into pursuing a more righteous way of life. He just says walk away. St. Paul says a similar thing about life in the church when he talks about take note of those who cause divisions among you and avoid them. He doesn't say love them into submission or tolerate them because eventually they'll change or any of those sorts of things. Instead, what the Bible does talk about in those cases is pretty confrontational. It's either rebuke them in the presence of others that everyone may stand in fear. Okay, so there's that command. Or Matthew 18, you go and tell him his fault privately, and if he doesn't listen to you, then you take 2 or 3 others, you tell him his fault. If he doesn't listen to you, then you tell it to the church, and if he doesn't listen to the church, then you treat him as a Pharisee or a tax collector. This have nothing to do. Walk away, okay? So there is that yes, there's a direct confrontation to those who are on the path to foolishness, or just walk away. This has applications for our temptation and sin too. So often our temptations could be dealt with simply by physically leaving whatever situation we're in. Getting up, walking out of the room, getting up away from whatever it is that you are being tempted to do that's wrong, away from the people, hang up the phone, getting in your car and going home. And yeah, you might have to say, well, why'd you leave last night? Well, fine. But sometimes, a lot of times, our temptations can literally be dealt with and solved by moving ourselves from one location to another. So Solomon's advice here, leave the presence of a fool, for there you do not meet words of knowledge, applies even to us today. Verse 8, the wisdom of the prudent is to discern his way, but the folly of fools is deceiving. So the wise are always kind of doing some self-critique, looking at it and saying, well, am I really pursuing righteousness? Am I really learning? Am I really growing? Is this really true? They ask those questions. There's a constant evaluation going on. The folly of fools is just to just kind of go with the flow. And that tends to deceive because Satan is designing that deception. He makes it pretty easy. If you've never read C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, I would recommend that you do that. It describes a fictional exchange between 2 demons who are trying to lead this man to hell, okay? And they write back and forth about successes and failures and how they plan to do this, but then this happened and all this sort of stuff. So it's a unique kind of perspective on spiritual warfare. It can be humorous at times, especially if you know that C.S. Lewis is really writing about himself, that he's sort of the man who's being fought over. And then you see how he comes to faith and frustrates the plans of the demons named Wormwood and Uncle Screwtape. So it's something to read if you've never read it. It's kind of interesting. But Satan actually designs stuff for us to fall into. And if we are just going along with the flow, Satan's pretty good at helping us just keep on flowing down the wrong path, okay? So constant evaluation and correction are needed for those who want to walk the path of righteousness. Because again, our hearts are drawn to the other way. Fools mock at the guilt offering, but the upright enjoy acceptance, or there is acceptance among the upright. So in Israel, there were a number of sacrifices and offerings given at the temple. Some of those were guilt offerings, and some of those were sin offerings. The difference between what those offerings were for has been debated for thousands of years, and we're still not exactly sure. So maybe some people are, but What's the difference? Why offer a sin offering and a guilt offering? There's lots of explanations out there. One of the ones that I think about is perhaps most helpful is understanding that Jesus came to do away with really two types of our sinfulness, okay? So there's the inherited guilt that we have received from our parents and our grandparents and all of humanity going back to Adam and Eve. That sin of disobedience to God has corrupted all of us on down the line. Now, that I was born into when, well, David says, in sin did my mother conceive me, okay? So that's his way of saying the moment we are conceived and become a person in the womb of our mother, we have already inherited that guilt, that original sin from all of our ancestors. How do we know that? Because we can die even in the womb, and the wages of sin is death. Therefore, what can die also has sin. Okay, you following me? All right. So that's the original sin or guilt that we talk about. But Jesus also came to atone for what we would call sins of commission and omission. Actual sins, they're often called. I mean, that not that they're actually sins, but that we actually did. Okay? So not what Adam did, not what my parents did, not what my grandparents did. No. There's also things that I have done that are sinful and wrong. So Jesus came to atone for them. So Jesus atones both for my original guilt and also my actual sins that I have committed and will commit. Those two things together are all wiped out in Christ, okay? So when we understand that, I think when we go back and look at the offerings in the Old Testament that are meant to point us ahead to the greater sacrifice of Jesus Christ, then it makes a lot more sense. So a guilt offering is more for that inherited original sin, whereas a sin offering is more for something that we have actually done recently, okay? I'm not saying it always works out that way, but that's how I look at that. Let me just check here. Okay. Actual sin. So people that don't think that they have any guilt, like, I didn't do that, it's not my fault. They look, you don't have to give that guilt offering. That's dumb. Even though God said to do it, people just, we mock that. But the upright enjoy acceptance. So those who follow what God has prescribed for the sacrifices, they enjoy acceptance because God has set up this way to get right with him, right? And to despise that for whatever reason is foolishness. So to look at our sacrament of the altar, right? So he eat this little wafer and drink this wine and that forgives sins. Well, that's foolishness. Well, absolutely, it's foolishness. It sounds dumb, right? It's like, okay, it's like some sort of magic and whatever. Now you're going to tell me Jesus is in there? Like, that goes against all my rational understanding. I definitely understand and can see how somebody looking at it from the outside would do that. But here's the thing. The guy who told you to do that also said, kill me, and 3 days later I'll rise to life again. And by all records and eyewitness accounts, did exactly that. If that guy tells me to eat this bread and drink this cup, I'm going to do it. All right? If Jesus would have said, I want you to come to church and do 25 jumping jacks while reciting the alphabet backwards and your sins will be forgiven, that's what we would do. Okay? Because he's God and he sets up, that's the way that you receive my grace. It's the means of grace. So when God sets up this sacrificial system with guilt offerings and sin offerings, right? And oblations and wine offerings and the scapegoat and the sacrificial lamb and all of that sort of stuff, if that's how God wants to be related to, that's what we do. Because he's God, okay? So even if we don't understand it, we do it. So fools would look at that and go, well, God's wrong about this. That sounds foolish, right? So a lot there in the guilt offering. We don't know exactly what the difference was, but I think it helps to look at it in terms of what Christ redeems us from. So our original sin, original guilt, and our actual sins that we commit. Verse 10, the heart knows its own bitterness, and no stranger shares its joy. This is one of the themes that I think is in this chapter particularly, that human beings are complicated. Feelings are complicated. They make for complicated individuals. If any of you have a teenager, you know this intrinsically because you're dealing with it. God bless them, right? And we all went through that too, but it's hard for us to remember that. It was half a lifetime ago. But human beings are complicated and feelings are complicated. So I think we have that. So we can't really look into the heart and understand someone, what they're feeling with exactly, but you can look as to outside markers. The heart knows its own bitterness, and no stranger shares its joy. Other people, as comforting as they can be, they can't fully understand and know us. But we have a God who does. We have a Savior who does. He knows us better than we know ourselves in that respect. And so that creates this incredibly comforting relationship when you know that God actually loves you. It'd be terrifying if you were questioning as to whether God loved you, because if he knew everything about you, he could find ample reason to strike you with lightning, right? But if you have a God who knows everything about you and loves you still, that's incredibly comforting. So yes, human beings, our feelings are kind of veiled to the world, but they are not veiled to God. And so in bitterness and in joy, what a friend we have in Jesus, right? The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. This kind of goes back to the beginning verse about destroying one's house, but notice the difference between house and tent. Even if all you have is a tent, you will flourish. But people who are wicked, on the path of foolishness, they might have a mansion, but it's not going to amount to anything. Again, that doesn't mean necessarily in this life. There's a bunch of people that were wicked people that have had a lot of money in big houses, right? So we're primarily talking about, again, the end times and our eternal heaven, eternal rewards in that respect. Verse 12, there is a way that seems right to man, but its end is the way to death. Reason, okay, our own smarts. One of the worst things that people do is no matter where they are on the timeline of history, they imagine themselves to be the smartest people that have ever lived and ever will live, all right? So people like to tell you to, trust the science on whatever it is they're talking about, okay? And then you go back and you realize that at a certain point, everybody believed that the sun revolved around the earth. And why did they believe that? Well, because the science at the time proved it, okay? And then you have Copernicus, you have Galileo, you have others that come around and say, this might not be right, and we were able to change our understanding. But then we think, now we have it all figured out. We had Hubble, and now we have James Webb, and we can see all of this. So we know the universe is exactly 13.8 billion light years across, or whatever it happens to be, right? And we think that now we are the smartest people. So human reason is a fickle thing, and to understand that you may not understand everything is big on the path to wisdom, okay? So there is a way that seems right to man, but its end is the way of death. We can't always trust our own reason and wisdom. This is a difference between a magisterial and ministerial use of reason. Magisterial, that reason is above everything. It's the height and arbiter of everything that's true, okay? Ministerial use of reason says, God has given me a mind that can logically try to figure things out and learn from processes and observations and all of that, but that still doesn't mean that I know everything. Your reason ministers to something greater, an existence, a wisdom greater than you. Okay, those are different ways of looking at the world and looking at the self. And they are very much the difference between a secular worldview and a religious worldview. Secular worldview is that reason can explain everything. Human beings can figure it out just given enough time. Whereas a Christian worldview says that no, we are not almighty. There is a wisdom that is greater than us. Okay? So Proverbs bears this out. Verse 13, even in laughter the heart may ache, and the end of joy may be grief. Once again, human beings are complicated, and nobody knows our heart except for God. And that there can be these conflicting things, that even at funerals we may laugh. We may be joyful, there is still sadness and grief. We're not monochromatic, that there is a lot that goes into the making up of a person, and conflicting emotions are definitely part of that. It's normal, it's natural, it's okay. Might be stressful, but it's okay. The backslider in heart will be filled with the fruit of his ways. So those that turn back to the path of folly will reap the benefits of what they did. In contrast, the good man will be filled with the fruit of his ways. Well, that makes sense, right? Verse 15, the simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. So again, to be critical of what we're doing, to think about it, not just take it as it comes, to ask questions, and not just believe what we want to believe. That's a big thing today. People believe what they have presuppositions when they come to a topic that are usually influenced by what they've heard from peers or TV, media, celebrities, whoever, or pastors or gurus or whomever, okay? And they bring that supposition to something, and that affects it. Actually, I just saw a great example of this morning. I'm looking for a digital calipers. I work on watches, and so it's important that you get an accurate measurement of very small things, and calipers. And I bought a cheap one from Harbor Freight, right? And I've always wondered, is it accurate or not? So I was watching this guy talk about these 3 different digital calipers, and one was $20 and one was $170. Right? And he said, but when people test these, they come to presuppositions. We naturally assume that the one that is $170 is $170 because it's more accurate. And he said, I've watched people that when they take a 1-inch block that has been machined and is exactly 1 inch according to all standards, right? And they take the expensive calipers and they put that on there, and it doesn't give an exactly 1 inch. It's 1 inch and 1/1000th of an inch. And they go, oh, that can't be right. And so they wipe it. There must be some dust on there. So they wipe it off, and they fiddle around with it until they get 1 inch. And they go, oh, see, yep, it's accurate. And then they come to the $20 one, and they put it on that 1 inch, and it's 1 inch and 3/1000ths off. It's 3/1000ths off of an inch. And the people go, oh, well, we expect that from, something that's a lot less. They didn't bother to do the same diligence in cleaning, and because they already had assumed. That's what people do in the world today. They come to something with presuppositions, right or wrong, right? But important for our learning and our growth is to be critical and understand that, and to work against that to some extent. Not to distrust everything and constantly go, well, that can't be right, because that'll lead to madness. But to do some due diligence and make sure that you don't have a bias coming in, or at least you're aware of the bias and can operate with that in mind. One who is wise is cautious, turns away from evil. Again, we see leaving that company that way, going back on the path. A fool is reckless and careless. Obviously, that makes sense. Here in verse 17, we see what will become a major theme: a quick temper or a hot temper, short on patience, anger. A man of quick temper acts foolishly, right? Crimes of passion, right? A man of evil devices is hated. So a man who continually does this is hated by his peers. The simple inherit folly, but the prudent are crowned with knowledge. Okay. Again, simple here is not meaning like mental capacity, but we're talking about people that aren't critical about things, that don't desire to learn and grow, all of that. The prudent who think about what they're doing are often crowned with knowledge. The evil bow down before the good, the wicked at the gates of the righteous. So God here again is not talking necessarily about earthly things, although obviously Solomon, who we classify as a righteous king, David too, saw their evil, wicked, pagan-believing enemies bow down before them. So it does have some fulfillment in time and history, but really, again, we're always looking towards the end. And what basically is being said here is that wisdom will triumph over foolishness at the end. Verse 20, here's an example of you have to look at things in context. If you take it out of context, you're going to come with a completely different understanding. So verse 20, the poor is disliked even by his neighbor, but the rich has many friends, period. If you stopped there and you pulled verse 20 out of this and just put it on a piece of paper, you could easily tell someone, well, Solomon says that it's not good to be poor, because you won't have any friends. And it's good to be rich because you have friends. That's wisdom. And we see that played out in the world. People like people with money, right? So you could prove a lot by taking just verse 20. But if you put verse 20 back into the chapter and go back and follow it up with verse 21, and you got to keep them together, you see this. Whoever despises his neighbor is a sinner, but blessed is he who is generous to the poor. Now, all of a sudden, we see that the poor is disliked even by his neighbor is not something that's being recommended. It's just describing a reality of a sinful world. Also, a rich person has many friends is now portrayed as sort of a detriment that you have to be careful because it's not true friendship. And then we see the virtue that comes out in verse 21. So 20 and 21, you have to read together if you really want to understand the wisdom of Solomon here. But it's a good example of how you can take a text out of context, let it stand on its own, and basically prove anything. So always go back and read what's around there, and you'll get a better picture of what God is saying. Do they not go astray who devise evil? It's a rhetorical question. Those who devise good meet steadfast love and faithfulness. Again, the paths and where they end up. In all toil there is profit, but mere talk ends only to poverty. Again, this theme of honest hard work. Okay, not just talking about it. You actually have to go and do. Verse 24, the crown of the wise is their wealth, but the folly of fools brings folly. That the folly of fools brings folly, obviously. So people that are stumbling and trying to scheme often reap the benefits of that. Whereas the crown of the wise is their wealth. It doesn't mean that everybody who has wisdom will be wealthy. And also, we're not talking necessarily about material wealth as much as we might be talking about wisdom for the sake of wisdom itself, spiritual wealth, all of those things. But definitely we see the results that there is a different end when you're on these paths. Verse 25, a truthful witness saves lives, but one who breathes out lies is deceitful. That's similar to that kind of verse we had up above. Yes, we can definitely understand how someone who is truthful can save the life of another. Again, there is a communal aspect to wisdom. It benefits society. Honesty benefits society. In fact, our entire judicial system is based on the idea that honesty is a virtue, which is why I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God, was part of the oath that you took before you took the witness stand. All right. So our everything is built on this. So we definitely see how a truthful witness saves lives, and one who breathes out lies is deceitful. Makes sense. Verse 26, in the fear of the Lord, one has strong confidence, and his children will have a refuge. Again, the wisdom of God is found in the fear of the Lord. We saw that at the very beginning of Proverbs. Solomon is reiterating that theme here, also talking about the benefit to children. Again, Solomon started at the beginning of the book of Proverbs, addressing things to his sons and also to all of us who are spiritual children by faith in that respect. So the fear of the Lord is a refuge. We don't have to wonder about certain things. Whereas if we didn't have God and his explanation of things, we might be lost to all kinds of weird doubts and deceptions. Verse 27, the fear of the Lord. Again, here we can see how in Hebrew these are linked. The fear of the Lord, the fear of the Lord. So these were meant to be kind of together, right? Again, I mentioned that that's happening all the time throughout the Hebrew. And so it might seem like a smattering of sayings all put together, but there's an organization in the Hebrew that we don't always see. This is one of the places where we can kind of see that Solomon used the same words and they're translated that way. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life that one may turn away from the snares of death. Again, the paths. But also Jesus talks about this too. Fountain of life. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. Who had a perfect fear of the Lord, who was perfectly obedient to God the Father? Well, his son, Jesus Christ, right? And he becomes a fountain of life. His righteousness is attributed to us through faith. Jesus speaks this way in John chapter 4. And we're going to jump to John 4. Jesus and the woman of Samaria. All right, so remember, Jesus was a Jew, was not meant to have interaction, to buy and sell from Samaritans, even walk through their land. But Jesus went out of his way to engage Samaritans because they were sinners in need of repentance and redemption. And so he proves that through his very own ministry. So he comes to Jacob's well, which is in Samaria. We got that. A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." Samaritan woman said, "How is it you, a Jew, ask a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" Also, men would not be interacting with women they were not married to or a familial relationship with. So this was doubly bad. And plus, Jesus is a known rabbi at this time, so that's triply bad, inappropriate, as it were. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman says, according to her own rational thought, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. How are you going to get this special water from this well?" She's thinking rationally, again, a magisterial use of her reason. And then she scolds him a little bit. "Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." Jesus, a little bit snarky, says, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, lady. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again." He's like, "Do you get that I'm not talking about this water in the well, lady? The water that I will give him," look at this, "will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." And the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water that I may not be thirsty and have to come here." And then they have this wonderful, he says, "Go call your husband," because he knows that she's shacked up with someone. And if you've ever wondered where in the Bible it addresses cohabitation, here is one of the places, okay? Jesus basically goes through this process to get her to admit that she's not married to the person she's living with. And in fact, she's slept with quite a few guys. And Jesus says, "Yeah, you practically married them, or at least that's what you presented by sleeping with them. And that isn't true, is it?" She then goes back in to blame him about, "Oh, you're a Jew and you said we can't worship here and I'm a Samaritan," this, that, and other. Jesus will not be deterred, however. And he then, "You worship what you do not know, but we worship what we know. Salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here," right here, lady, "when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him." All right. The woman said, "I know that Messiah is coming." He was called Christ. "And when he comes, he will tell us all things." And Jesus gives one of the most premier revelations of who he is to this woman, a woman in Samaria at a well. "I who speak to you am this Messiah," he says. "I am this Christ. I am Yahweh in the flesh," right? So that's going on here. But look here, go back. A spring of water welling up. Okay, a constant supply doesn't run out. You don't have to keep going back to get it. This has to do with our forgiveness, all right? Your sin is not like a bar tab that you rack up and then you go to church on Sunday and Jesus wipes it off, pays it off, and then you start racking it up again. And then, like the Catholics believe, if you die before you get that forgiveness on Sunday, those sins that you haven't atoned for, you haven't confessed and done your penance and received forgiveness for, those you have to spend some time in purgatory atoning for, burning off before you get to go into heaven proper. Okay, so that's not what we're talking about here. And please don't just please understand that my description there about what Roman Catholics believe about purgatory and confession is highly generalized. Okay, and I'm being a little bit snarky about it, but it's not a bar tab. Your sin is not this bar tab that you have to like pay off every week, and that's why you go to church. God's forgiveness is a spring of living water that's constantly, you're in a constant state of cleansing grace, as it were, if you have Jesus. So I'm not worried about sins that I haven't yet confessed, okay? Because the fountain is always cleansing, always, right? Confession isn't for God to let him know what I've done. He already knows. Confession is for me, right? So anyway, Jesus is a fountain, not a well. And we see that wisdom here in Solomon. Verse 28, what we see is the last section, 28 through 35, all might be categorized as regal advice or royal advice, because verse 28 talks about a king, and then verse 35 also talks about a king. So that's bookended with this kingly language. And so we've understood that this section, even though it's applicable to all people, is particularly directed at his sons and those who would be rulers, okay? So it's advice to those who rule others or lead. In a multitude of people is the glory of a king, obviously, right? But without people, a prince is ruined. So Solomon is basically telling his successors, like, you have to care about the people. You can't just be this king who takes everything for himself and ignores the people. No, you're given by God to care for them, and they are necessary for you. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. So he said this earlier about the dangers of a hot temper. Now he's going to say that's not just for lay people and the common people out there in the kingdom. This is also for rulers. So Solomon is telling his sons, don't be hasty. Don't have a hot temper. All right. It's easy to get puffed up and with all your power and authority and say off with his head. And that would be saying that's not beneficial. So slow to anger, right, will give you more understanding. A tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. Don't worry about the kingdoms next to you and what they have. Just be content. Be peaceful with what you have and what your heart is set on. Here again, we'll see an address about the poor. Whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker. Again, that poor person was made by God and redeemed by Christ, okay? But he who is generous to the needy honors him. It's unclear that him is the poor man that he's honored, or if it's his maker, if it's God who's honored. That referent is obscure as far as I'm concerned. And that's why you see even here in the text that while maker is capitalized, this him is not, because we're not sure if we're talking about the poor man or we're talking about his maker. I don't know. Maybe it's both. This leads us to understand our own charity. There's two things that are always conflicting about being charitable, and that's the desire to be charitable to those who may be in need, and also the command to be good stewards of what God has given us. Okay, so when we see somebody on the street that wants money and we're like, well, I have some, but I don't know if they're going to use it for a good purpose, and that's a dilemma that everybody has. How you answer that, I guess, is up to you. I think there's benefits to considering things on both sides. I think one of the things that we have to consider is that society, by and large, has created means by which we can help lots of these people through an organized manner. Someone who wants to go around those means is more likely to have a nefarious purpose than someone who's willing to go through those means. Okay? That doesn't mean that everybody you meet is a con artist out on the street. It just is a fact that if you said, hey, you can go to this place and get food, that might for those that are really using I need food but really want your money for something else, they're not going to go because they're not really looking for the food. So they're going to be on the street asking for money but with a sign, will need food, that sort of thing. So that's all going around in our head. Here's the thing. Nowhere does God command us to investigate the worthiness of those that we are charitable to, right? If they abuse your charity, that's not your fault. That's on them. And God sees all and God will judge all. All right. Also, all this talk about generosity basically means that even if you are generous and it's taken advantage of, God's not going to let you be destitute, right? Again, maybe we're not talking in this life. Martin Luther gave away most of his possessions when he got married, so much so that his wife was hiding things in the house because he had a tendency to just give everything away to anybody that was in need, and he was making his own wife and children in the poorhouse. Okay, so we don't want to do that, but God will not take away our eternal kingdom, right? So God has a bigger treasury, and God will continue to care for us. But that doesn't mean that we should be stupid about it. So those things are always in conflict in the Christian. I want to be charitable. I'm called to be charitable. If I am generous and they abuse that, that's not on me. All of that's going on. At the same time, I don't want to forget my vocation and my requirements to take care of my own family and my own children, my own church, all of that sort of stuff that's there. How do you balance those two? And that answer is different for a lot of people. And I think that's okay. All right. But just realize that it's there, and the Bible isn't totally clear on that. But look at whoever is generous to the needy honors him, whether or not it was a valid or a scam. It's difficult. Nobody likes to be taken advantage of. The wicked is overthrown through his evil doing, but the righteous finds refuge in his death. Look at that. So again, a picture of the eschaton, last things. We're not just talking about here. We're talking about forever. So our reward is not always in this life, but it is always in the next. Wisdom rests in the heart of man of understanding. Again, it's easy for people that are seeking understanding to gain wisdom. Thing in motion continues in motion. It's a reiteration of that point that was made up above. But it makes itself known even in the midst of fools. It's amazing how a wise word can diffuse a situation when other people recognize it. Sometimes it's not recognized because of emotions or whatever, but you've all had those experiences, I'm sure, where there's an argument and then somebody comes up and says something and everybody kind of goes, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense, and diffuses the situation. So wisdom is valuable, in a communal aspect. Again, we see that here. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Again, this is the regal advice. So we see this advice primarily to rulers, but it's applicable to all of us. And finally, a servant who deals wisely has the king's favor, but his wrath falls on one who acts shamefully. The theme of honest work, of meaning what you say, all of that comes back here at the end, this bookend of the kingly advice, which is applicable to all of us. So that is our chapter for today. The three things that I want to focus on is that, one, remember that we often create our own problems, and the height of confession is really to acknowledge that yes, I may be able to blame this person and that person, but in the end, it's really me who did these things. That's an honest appraisal of our spiritual condition, and that is beneficial to our spiritual health. Two, we affect those around us for good or for ill. Righteousness and foolishness has a communal aspect, and that it applies even in groups of friends, even in a family. So what we are putting out in our family affects people. If we are pursuing righteousness, pursuing peace, pursuing reconciliation in a family, that is a good way to go through life. And I know that sounds dumb, but we're often too caught up in the emotions to do that. And we want to get back at the person who wronged us. We want to shun the people who shunned our family member, that sort of thing. And we affect those around us by what we put out. So if you don't like your family situation, work on pursuing righteousness yourself in the family structure, and maybe that'll be there. If your friends are influencing you towards wickedness and foolishness, Solomon's wisdom, leave. Find new friends, basically. It's hard to do. And then finally, anger is not a virtue. And again, that's in the duh category, right? Or is it? I look around at our world now and I see that anger is prized. So when somebody wrongs you, you get back at them and you get back at them hard. Revenge is a type of anger. Certainly, hoodlum culture, people getting the likes of their friends by punching people in the face on the street for no reason, by being murderous, those sorts of things, fighting. Obviously, all of that is glorified by our culture. Well, it has been. I mean, Rome glorified violence. Come on. So humanity likes to seek out violence, and we like to feast our eyes upon it, but it is part of the path to foolishness. If you want to be better, if you want to take some practical thing, become tranquil, or at least when you're met with aggression, when you're met with complaint, when you're met with sin, work on not letting it affect your anger right away. Take a breath, listen. You might be seething inside, but just be tranquil and let it kind of melt. Think about it, and then speak truth. Maybe speak less and mean what you say. And that's the path of wisdom, at least. Hard to do, but nobody said being wise was easy. I'll put the link to last week's study on Proverbs chapter 13 up here. And I hope you have a wonderful day. And thank you so much for studying along with us. God bless your pursuit of righteousness and wisdom in Christ Jesus. Take care.